making the switch from compound bow hunter to crossbow. That's this episode of Death by Bunjie. In the interest of full disclosure, I want everyone to know that I have absolutely no experience whatsoever hunting with a compound bow, a vertical bow. I have never been in the woods with one. The last time I shot a compound bow was probably in the late 1980s. I had a compound bow for a summer or two and I shot it back then. Making the transition from rifle hunter to crossbow hunter, I've learned a lot along the way, so much so that I decided to start this YouTube channel and make videos about it. And I hope that they've been helpful for those of you who are new to crossbow hunting. Now, yes, it's all archery. So if you're making the transition from compound bow hunter to crossbow hunter, you already have one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest hurdles out of the way. You've already conquered that, and that is getting your head around the concept of archery hunting. It differs completely, in my opinion, from rifle hunting. Close-in shots, up close and personal with deer, that's a big part of archery. That's what, to me, defines archery hunting. So you've already got your head around that. You won't have to learn how to get up close and personal with deer. You won't have to learn things like, yes, we only shoot at deer that aren't alert. You won't have to learn about the fact that you got to aim small, miss small. You won't have to learn about how a shorter shot is much better than a long shot. Those are all things that are very important for us as we transition to archery hunting. So you don't have to learn all that stuff. What do you have to know, though, if you're making the transition from compound bow hunter to crossbow hunter? The biggest reason people make inaccurate shots in crossbow hunting, from what I have read, and from what I've noticed as well, is the concept of canting. Canting is essentially where your bow is leaning to one side or the other. Now, with a compound bow, does that affect your shot? It absolutely does. Those of you who hunt with vertical bows know from experience that if you're holding the bow at an angle, it's not going to shoot in the same way that it does if you're holding it this way. The reason for that is you've turned your sights, you've turned your pins off to an angle. It is no different with a crossbow. If I turn Bunjie towards you like this just to demonstrate that fact, if I'm shooting like this, my reticles have changed and my aiming point is different, and now when I pull the trigger, that arrow is not going to go where I want it to go. The arrow is still going to have a vertical drop. In other words, when I shoot out the crossbow, as the arrow leaves the rail, it's going to go toward the target, but it's going to drop straight down, straight off of where it was. Unfortunately, with a scope, if you have a scope on your crossbow, it is a situation where now the reticles are lined up and down this way instead of straight up and down, and you might be aiming over here, but the arrow is going to go over there. So it's definitely going to affect your shot. You need to be very careful of that with crossbow hunting. When you are hunting with a crossbow, make sure that you are holding it perfectly level when you go to take your shot. The next difference that I can talk to you about a little bit here between a crossbow and a compound bow is, and I've mentioned this before on a lot of my other videos, with a crossbow, you're kind of one and done. You really don't get a follow-up shot with a crossbow, especially if you're using a crank to cock your crossbow or anything like that. When you cock the crossbow, it takes 30 seconds or so to a minute to cock the crossbow properly, and then with a rope cocker, and then you load the arrow and all that. It does take a little bit of time. With a compound bow, you might get a follow-up shot. You are not going to get those follow-up shots typically with a crossbow. I've mentioned this before in other videos, but one of the first things you're going to notice when you switch from a compound bow to a crossbow is that the arrows are much, much shorter. Now, they're going to look familiar. They have nocks. You can put a luminock on there. They got vanes or fletchings, whichever you choose. I did another video about arrows. I do urge you to stick with whatever your manufacturer recommends on that sort of thing. And here I have a mechanical broadhead. Doesn't look that much different from the broadhead you might use on your compound bow. And in fact, you want to test them out, but many of the broadheads that you're familiar with using on your compound bow may work very well with a crossbow. Some of them will not. Many of the older style broadheads could not survive the initial force of leaving the crossbow when this comes off the rail, and your broadheads would open prematurely. That's a problem. So to prevent against that, use a crossbow approved broadhead. Don't use a broadhead that is not designed for crossbows. You will regret it. One of the first videos I uploaded to this Death by Bunjie YouTube channel, another subscriber commented on that video that she actually had a broadhead open up and hit the stirrup on her crossbow. It opened up leaving the crossbow so quickly that it actually caught the stirrup. You can't have stuff like that happening, right? That's no knock whatsoever. There's so much good equipment out there. That's not really what this channel is about. But nonetheless, you're going to want to just test, make sure, no matter what you're using, no matter what broadhead, even if it's the broadhead that your manufacturer recommends, do practice with one of those broadheads and do make sure that they're going to work properly when you head out into the woods to hunt. Now, like I said, I don't have any experience hunting with a compound bow, so I really can't add an awful lot to that, but I still wanted to make this video because I still want to help people enjoy crossbow hunting as much as I do. So what I did is I posted a question on our Facebook page, and I was fortunate enough to have a whole bunch of friends of Bunjie there put on some comments and give me some feedback about what it takes to make that transition successful from compound bow hunting to crossbow hunting. One of the things that came up was the fact that the weight is different with a crossbow. Most of your crossbows, this weighs 6 or 7 pounds. I guess that's a big difference from holding out a compound bow and hunting with that all day long. You will notice that the size of a crossbow, and I have mentioned this before, a crossbow is not a very convenient weapon. It's an inconvenient weapon in a lot of ways. You have to hold it the whole time you're in a tree stand. Now, yes, you can hang it by the stirrup on a peg in your tree stand or whatever you choose to do. In a blind, I typically have it leaning up against my leg, up against my lap, so that I can lift it up on a moment's notice. But it's a big weapon. It takes up a lot of space, and pulling that around, moving that around in a tree stand or in a blind is going to be inconvenient. In addition to that, you're going to want to keep an eye on the limbs and make sure that those limbs have clearance. When the crossbow is cocked and the string is held back under the trigger mechanism, the limbs are shorter and they are tucked in a little bit more. But as soon as you pull that trigger, those limbs are coming out of there. It is not uncommon for people to experience those limbs hitting the side of a blind or hitting the side of a tree stand or a branch or part of a tree or whatever. Make sure that you have a clear space, not only for the flight of your arrow, but also for those limbs. With the vertical bow, you got the same issue, but it was up and down. You know, you've got to make sure that your bottom limb is not hitting the tree stand, that your top limb on your vertical bow is not going to expand out on a compound bow and hit the a limb above you or something like that. You still have to pay attention to that, but with a crossbow, it's the same thing. It's horizontally instead of vertically. You're also going to want to make sure that you have some sort of mechanism to support your crossbow. Now, if you're hunting in a tree stand, that's not too hard to do. I love having shooting rails just like you would use as a rifle hunter. I lean the crossbow on the shooting rail, put my hand down, put the crossbow on top of that, sort of move it around almost like a pool cue, move it around and use it that way sometimes. I have shot off my knee in a blind without too much trouble. I do that every year, shoot a deer out of a blind as much as I can. I love hunting out of a blind with a crossbow. It's awesome. But you're pretty much limited to a straight ahead view, a straight ahead shot, and you've got to hold it up. Now, a monopod, putting it on a shooting stick of some sort, adjusted ahead of time to do that, is a great way to support that crossbow. But that weight's going to get to you, and if you're waiting for the deer to position, then you're going to want to have something to support the crossbow. Another thing you can look at is this field pod. I have the field pod here. This is a Caldwell Deadshot field pod that I have set up in front of me that I use in all my videos that I do here on this side porch. I've got the crossbow set up here, got Bunjie all set up here to display it as part of the video as a prop, basically. But it's a prop and it props it up perfectly. If I want to hunt with this, I can turn this right around, swivel it in my blind, move it around like this just fine. You can hunt with this if you want to go and simply hunt in the woods off the ground. It is a perfect thing to have with you. You can adjust the height of it. You can move it around. It doesn't make any noise. You can camouflage it by wrapping some skirting around it or something like that. It would work just awesome from the ground. I have tried that, never been successful. That's one of those things. It's on the short list also of things that I want to do with crossbow hunting from the ground and being successful, harvesting a deer or other animal that way. Come pretty close with turkeys. Pretty close with turkeys hunting from the ground, and I'm not talking about in the blind, I'm talking about actually being out on the ground. But hunting with a ghillie suit or something like that is a great way to enjoy crossbow hunting. I have attempted it numerous times, never been successful, but a field pod like this would be a great way to support that crossbow while you're hunting from the ground. Another comment on our Facebook page that seemed to be a recurring comment, and this is a very good point, is that crossbows create an awful lot of vibration, much more than your vertical bows, much more than your compound bows, and that creates two issues, two distinctions between hunting with a vertical bow and hunting with a crossbow. The first is it makes them a lot louder. Generally speaking, crossbows are louder than vertical bows. I'm sure there's exceptions both ways, but the people on the Facebook page who have made the transition from compound bow to crossbow, or those Facebook likers who actually hunt with both, there are many people that hunt with both, generally speaking, they all agree that the crossbow is going to be louder than the compound bow. That's another reason why crossbow hunting is kind of one and done. Every deer in the neighborhood hears your crossbow when it goes off. The other problem with all that vibration is not just that it creates all that sound, but it also creates more maintenance issues with your crossbow. I'm getting ready to go to Maryland here. Really excited. Less than 2 weeks. We're going to Maryland again. Bunjie and I are going to go down here and try and shoot a big buck. We've got another little surprise for you coming on this trip, and I can't wait to make these fall videos, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. I've done some fun videos in the past about my hunting trips and stuff, and that's one of the things I love doing. It's the highlight of the whole season for me, for making these videos, but I cannot wait with some of the, I just hope it goes as well as I'm hoping it will. I'm pretty excited about it. So Maryland's going to be a great trip for me this year. But you're going to want to go around, and this time of year is the time to do that. Go around with your Allen wrenches, go around and make sure that you have tightened up all of your limbs, all of your bolts, all of your little nuts and screws and everything on your whole crossbow. Go through and just snug them up and make sure they're all tight. Make sure you have to do all that maintenance, because all that vibration, every time you take a shot, you're vibrating that whole crossbow and it works those little pieces loose. Maintenance, general theme of the comments on the Facebook page, the feedback that I have had from compound bow users is that maintenance is more required on a crossbow than it is on a vertical bow. I've gotten feedback both ways on the use of a scope on a crossbow, though. I had some people say, oh, it's so much better because you have a scope. That's an advantage with a crossbow. And that's a common theme, and I generally agree with that. The pins that you would use on a compound bow are a scope of sorts, and they're sights of sorts, but using the scope with the magnification, they really like that. Some people really like that. On the other hand, some of the feedback on our Facebook page was, I really don't like the scope. I prefer the pins, and I get that. I think with the pins, your vision, you still have your vision of the whole area with the pins on a compound bow, but I think with the scope, you're magnified and you're zoomed in on that area. Some people don't like that as much, and I understand that. So that might be something, if you're making the transition from compound bow hunter to crossbow hunter, you might actually have a little bit of problem adjusting to the concept of using a scope. On the other hand, everybody shot a rifle with a scope. Most hunters have done that. One other interesting comment we got on the Facebook page was the fact that you still need to have good form with the crossbow, just like you do with a compound bow. You have to follow through on your shot, allow that arrow to leave your crossbow before you go moving the crossbow. You don't fire it and then look through the scope and look down. I like to look through the scope, try to see the arrow leave, try to see the arrow and follow it to the target, and then not put the crossbow down until it's hit the target. That kind of good form is something that you have to have both with a compound bow, but also with a crossbow. So there are some similarities between the two weapon choices as well. And lastly, one of the comments that really struck me as interesting, coming off of the Facebook page about that transition, was that some people were a little bit disappointed with the crossbow when they made the transition to the crossbow, because they felt like with the compound bow, they really enjoyed going to the shooting range, shooting the compound bow all the time, taking hundreds of shots a day and practicing and getting really good at it. And with a crossbow, you don't do that as much. I kind of get what they're saying, and that's something I hadn't really thought about. You still need to practice with a crossbow, but not nearly as much as you do with a compound bow. I've always looked at that as a positive, but I can understand why, if you enjoy being outside shooting at a target and that's part of what you do, if you take that out of the picture when you go and shoot a crossbow, I understand why that would be a negative to you. The crossbow, you can go to the range and shoot it all day long, but there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, if you shoot this 100 shots in a day, it's going to kill your back, because you got to cock this every time. If I shoot this a dozen times, I can shoot it a dozen times, make sure I'm sighted in, move it around, move stuff around. Takes, go out there and shoot for an hour, not a big deal. But if you're going to do this for hours on end, your back's going to give out at some point. The other thing is, I just want to throw this out there. Generally speaking, I don't think crossbows are designed to be shot hundreds of times in a day. If anything, shooting them more, once it's sighted in, it can only make it less sighted in. It can only create problems if you do a lot of shooting with your crossbow. And essentially what I'm saying is, it's that vibration, the violence of firing this thing that shakes this whole setup. You know, you're only going to loosen things up and stretch the string and change the sighting in, and you're going to make things worse, not better. Once it's sighted in, I like to let it sit and then just make sure it remains sighted in while I'm hunting. That's pretty much the extent of the shooting that I do. I think you'll wear out a crossbow a lot faster if you're shooting it all the time. So that might be a negative for a lot of people who make that transition. You might get a crossbow and say, man, you know, I really don't like the crossbow because I can't shoot it all that much. And in fact, some people I have talked to people online who have two crossbows, one for shooting all the time and another one for actually hunting with. You know, to each his own. Well, that about sums it up. I'm making the transition, everything I can give you, if you are thinking of making that transition from compound bow hunter to crossbow hunter. I wish you the absolute best with that, and I hope if you have additional tips that I haven't mentioned here about making the transition, please leave them in the comments. I think it's very important that we share that information with other people so that other people who want to get into crossbow hunting can have that information and get a little bit ahead of the game, one step ahead as they make that transition. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you subscribe. I wish you nothing but the greatest successes as you head into the woods with your crossbow in the upcoming season. And until next time, all hail Bunjie!
The second state is number one in my book.